Hello, everyone. My name is Lynne McIntee, and we're here today. We're here with Youth Connections Café, and we are all about connecting, creating, and inspiring the youth of today. We are hosted actually by Moksha Canada Foundation and Bell Let's Talk. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I have a lovely guest I'll introduce in just a moment. Before we get started, actually, I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. I'm in Ontario, and my guest is in Alberta, but I'm doing a land acknowledgement from Ontario. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we call home. So welcome to everyone, and thank you for allowing us to be here today. And I have a wonderful guest. I'm just going to do a little bit of a bio on my guest, and then you can branch out from there. So today we're discussing youth dating, violence, and awareness, a very important topic today and any day, really. Our guest is Dr. Deinera Exner-Cortens from the University of Calgary. She is Associate Professor in Psychology and Scientific Co-Director of PREVNet. She has a larger bio, and I'm sure she'll walk us through that as well, too. I can actually just highlight some areas. You have worked in public health as well, and you are the Co-Director of PREVNet, right? And that's one of the reasons we're here today, talking about a very important topic for our youth who will be tuning in at another time perhaps. And Youth Connections Café is highlighting youth dating and violence. So welcome to my guest. Hello, doctor.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for your graciousness allowing this opportunity for us. We're so very, very grateful. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. A little bit about Moksha Canada Foundation, just before we get started. We are focusing on a series of community forums and panel discussions. Moksha Canada raises awareness on issues that are of concern to diverse communities across Ontario, but also across Canada and the world. They include, but are not limited to, racism and discrimination, issues related to newcomer settlement, youth, seniors, and gender-based discrimination as well. So a variety of things that we do, and please reach out to us on our social media if you have any ideas for future programming. We'd love to hear from you and just really take a moment in time with you. So as we're doing here today with Dr. Exner-Cortens. So Dr. Exner-Cortens, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I right now am living as a guest on Treaty 7 in what is colonially known as Alberta, as you said, in Mohkinstsis, or also known as Calgary. I grew up in southern Alberta and did graduate school in different places and was really fortunate to get to come back to Alberta to work and live and play. My work focuses on healthy relationships promotion with youth. So learning what youth need to feel safe, supported in their interpersonal relationships, particularly new romantic and sexual relationships that for many youth start to happen during this age range. So that's what I focus on. And I think that's why I'm here to chat with you today.
Oh, that's amazing. And I know that you've prepared a presentation as well. And I just wanted to actually just maybe double back on something here. So I noticed from the website for PREVNet in particular, I wonder if we could just define what dating violence is
Okay.
for our listeners and viewers. Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah. And maybe I'll also mention what PREVNet is too, if that's okay. When you said about my background, that's a good thing to mention. So PREVNet is an organization that works to bring what we know from research into practice and bring what we know from practice back into research. And we work with lots of organizations across the country. And I'm really fortunate to be the scientific co-director. So I help to work with a lot of different community agencies that are doing dating violence work. So in terms of dating violence, it's defined as physical violence, sexual violence, as well as psychological aggression experienced in dating or romantic relationships in usually the ages, or at least the ages that we work with, from ages 11 to 18. It also includes stalking. It can happen between current or former dating or sexual partners. It can happen to youth of any gender or sexuality, and can happen either in person or online as well. So I think a lot of people think about the physical violence part, but it's actually quite involves a lot of different potential things, and physical violence may or may not be part of that.
Multi-layered and very complex, it sounds like. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And what was noticeable to me was the age of 11. It seems people might be surprised by that. And could you maybe speak to more of that and that age range? Yeah.
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 So definitely the number of youth that experience it goes up as they get older, but we do know from research that it can start as early as sixth grade. So that would be often around age 11. Um, and so it is something I think, parents and caregivers and other folks might not think about dating or sexuality so early, but it's something that youth are engaging in, they're interested in, they're learning about, from media, from things they see, from families, from communities, schools, all those kinds of things. So it is something that we want to start talking about really early, just so that youth know what to look out for. Because a lot of times it's not talked about a lot. And so they might be experiencing these things and feel uncomfortable or unsafe, but they're not sure if something's wrong. So just making sure they have that awareness, like you were saying, is really, really important, and that's happening as early as possible.
Speaking from the education background as well, and teaching youth in primary education, but also adults as well, I'm just curious as how receptive are schools in receiving that information?
Yeah, I think they are receptive. I mean, certainly they see it on their school grounds, they see it among their students. And dating violence can blend with lots of other things that might be happening, be that identity-based bullying, sexual harassment, slut shaming. So schools know that these things are happening and are often pretty open to addressing it. I think in Canada, understanding dating violence is newer. So a lot of the work we do at PREVNet is exactly what we're doing today, which is awareness raising, that this is something that happens, that it's actually pretty common, that it can start young, and it's something that we want caring adults to be looking out for. And so because it's newer as well in Canada, there's less maybe guidance for schools. And so that's another thing we work on at PREVNet, is trying to help different organizations sort of know what to do, whether that be policy or different programs that they might implement to help prevent dating violence.
No, thank you very much for that. So you're somewhat helping with curriculum building, I guess, around that.
Yeah, so our job is really to be kind of a broker, I guess, between sort of practice and research. And so we support 21 different programs across the country through a community of practice model to help as they develop their own programs. They're the local experts in their communities, they have that grassroots knowledge. And so we're there to help them with different implementation ideas or evaluation, how to adapt it. As well as things like this or other organizations who might have questions about what to do. We're doing a lot of policy engagement around what provinces or schools could do to make sure that when youth unfortunately experience this, it's clearly defined in terms of what it is, what their options are. That's not really the case right now across Canada. It's not in policy, and so yeah, we're trying on, I'd say, multiple fronts to help the community be prepared to prevent and address dating violence.
Could you underscore PREVNet and when it started actually, and when you've yeah.
Yeah, PREVNet started actually in 2002. It was a bullying network, and in 2006 became PREVNet as it is today. It was funded by the National Centers of Excellence funding for bullying prevention. It was founded by Deb Pepler and Wendy Craig. And so PREVNet traditionally was really focused on bullying, but then in 2018, which is sort of when I came on board, we were very fortunate to be funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada to do this work supporting organizations offering dating violence prevention. So since 2018, I've had a really equal focus on dating violence prevention. And we work with lots and lots of researchers across the country, over 60 organizations, trying to really help build their capacity to do the work in their local communities using what we know from research and different forms of evidence, including lived experience and practice experience, what might help prevent bullying and dating violence in their communities.
So empowering the communities to do so and implement. enabling.
Yes, that's not us. That's not, they're the experts in their areas. We want to help support them and build their capacity in areas that they identify they could use that support.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Thank you. So as PREVNet, it's operating at a few different areas right now in terms of universities. Could you maybe underscore that as well? So you're in Calgary, but
yes,
there you have some sister and partner programs.
So so PREVNet is currently located at Queen's in Ontario, but it also has an arm in Calgary with me. And then all the other universities that are engaged, it's through individual researchers who want to take on pieces of work or support some of the projects that PREVNet is working with. And so it's fairly diverse. We don't have like a specific program that we're offering. We do have some trainings. We have quite a few trainings, but in terms of like being in the schools to prevent dating violence, our role is really more supporting those local community organizations to do that work. And part of that is helping to train educators or train community service providers to be more ready to do dating violence prevention. So a lot of our work also right now is focused on building some of those tools to help educators in particular be ready to respond when dating violence happens in their schools.
You mentioned all the different organizations that you're working with, and education, yes, but public health workers as well, and all the other ones that kind of go into that, I guess, basket, so to speak, right?
Yeah, it's quite a diverse group of folks, which is great. It can, be challenging sometimes just getting communication across all those different sectors, but we have traditional like violence against women organizations engaged in this, public health, education, other health services. So, and it really does take that collective of folks who meet youth where they're at in different places to do that work. And so trying to also connect a lot of those different sectors, because sometimes a lot of great work is happening in one area and stuff in another. And so how do you actually get them to communicate? So trying to help facilitate some of that communication if we can.
Yeah. Something that comes to mind, what about someone who's living on the streets and accessing services and resources, not necessarily part of the system, so to speak? How does that work? And would you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I wish I had more of an answer. So we know, for example, that queer and non-binary and trans youth are at higher risk for dating violence because of structural systems of homophobia and transphobia. Because of those same systems, those same youth are more likely to be houseless. In terms of what providers can do, I mean, there's so many needs that need to be met, but I think it is still important. Like, we know those youth would be at higher risk, particularly around, some sexualized forms of violence. So I think that providers are aware and providing supports to youth who might be experiencing that. In terms of the research, there's just really nothing in that area, which is a huge gap. A lot of it has focused, and this is good, on like school-based prevention, which is good, but it really misses like youth who are most at risk in terms of what they need. And since, youth might listen to this, the thing the field I think is most missing is youth voice. So researchers have not traditionally asked youth what they want, which is just such a big miss. And so we don't really know what youth themselves want when dating violence happens or other forms of sexualized violence, particularly youth who are multiply marginalized by different systems. And so some of the work that we're starting to try to do is to really work with youth at PREVNet. We have a National Youth Advisory Council to figure out, what that might be, what that might look like, because it's not the place of adults to say what that is. And so I wish very much I had a better answer for you, but even just simple things like having posters up in healthcare clinics or other services that youth might access. It's not a huge intervention, but at least it lets youth know you're aware. It's not okay. You are a safe person to talk to. And if you're going to do that, then also make sure you are a safe person to talk to, and you know what these issues are and know where to send youth if they're dealing with issues around experienced violence. So it's a great question. I wish I had a better
No,
answer.
thank you for addressing that. I appreciate that. And just as you said, it's there's not an easy answer for that. And something that comes to mind, and maybe I'm just bridging into a different area, but I just thought mobile, sort of knowledge, mobile on the move kind of knowledge going into different parts of the community, and how we have that for public health in many cases, and where it could be tied into programming that way.
Totally.
Yeah, it comes to mind. So yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole like outside of preventing it before it happens, which is important, we just don't know nearly as much about it once it's happened. Like, what do youth want? What's effective? How can we use different systems or service providers who might be serving youth and meeting them where they're at? So that's just an area that we need to learn a lot more about. And, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. And it would be really important because we know these are issues facing youth and are particularly likely to occur for youth who are multiply marginalized, and they deserve to have access to resources and providers who understand, who are able to help them in those situations. And I don't think that's currently the situation for most youth, which is not great and is children's rights violation. So it's something we really need to work on collectively as a country. Sure.
And putting the unity back in community, right? That's
Exactly. Yes.
very much so.
Yes.
And
It
I
doesn't
love,
belong to any one sector or what, like it needs this wraparound approach. And so finding ways to do that is really, really important.
Yeah. And as you're underscoring, is really ultimately it's the youth voice that's so important. We can talk about it all day, but in the end, we're looking for the youth to speak up, and youth advisory committees can be so effective,
Yes.
and helping to move things forward or bridge into different areas of research or expertise, I guess, if you will. Wow. Well,
Yeah, I think anyone who's doing this work, like just finding ways to engage youth, because they're still not at the table. And I love doing this work because I get to work with youth and they're so smart and thoughtful and really understand and have great ideas. And so that's usually my first recommendation is like, are there youth at the table? Like, who are you talking to understand how your services are being received or perceived, what services are lacking? And so just finding ways to engage youth in meaningful ways is just so important.
Because it's one thing to open the door, but feeling that you can see yourself at the table is another thing, right?
Exactly. Totally.
Yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning that. Really appreciate that. And just coming top of mind, actually, not necessarily on the questions list, but I just wondered about cross-culturally then, and multilingual resources based on what we're talking about right now. Is that if you could speak to that.
Limited for sure. So predominantly English language resources, globally some Spanish. There's actually a fair amount of work in the global South on dating violence. Within Canada, there are French resources. There are some resources that have been translated into a few other languages. I'm not aware of any that are translated into any Indigenous languages, though there are programs that focus and work with different First Nations communities. So again, it's something that is really lacking in terms of how services are being offered, but certainly for organizations, like making sure that your materials are available in a way that's relevant beyond just language, even how it's presented, culturally, how it fits, making sure it's really plain language. I think these are things organizations know, but just doing it can always be tricky with time and resources, but having that information accessible is super important. And then I think one of the tricks can be also finding facilitators. So a lot of these programs and groups are facilitated, and finding folks that can do it and in another language can sometimes be a barrier. And so, part of the capacity building that we're doing and that other organizations are doing, I think, is around hopefully training up more folks who can do this work, because we know it's ideal if the facilitator reflects the youth in the group. They know their community, they understand their experiences, they can speak their language. And so making sure there's opportunities for lots of different people to get trained to understand, what this issue is, and to be able to offer prevention and other services in their local communities is really, really critical, for sure.
No, thank you for addressing that. Really appreciate it. And again, from your website, I just thought I would take some of these things here. Would you mind speaking to, I guess, what are the signs and maybe who is at risk, as you had mentioned before? Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
So just overall, and this is like very general, but we know that about 1 in 3 youth in Canada report some dating violence in a dating or romantic relationship in the past year. So I think whenever I say that, it's a lot higher than what people think. In terms of physical violence, it's about 1 in 10, and similar for sexual violence, although more likely to be experienced by cisgender girls and other marginalized genders. So it is quite prevalent. In terms of who is at risk, it really follows social power structures in terms of who has power and access to resources and who doesn't. I think people often say, and it's true, that dating violence can happen to anyone. So doesn't mean just because you have the benefits of being in certain dominant groups that you wouldn't experience it. But on the other hand, we know that youth who are marginalized, particularly multiply marginalized, are more at risk. So in Canada, that includes Black youth, queer, trans, non-binary youth, Indigenous women and girls. And so thinking about in prevention, like why that's happening, it's not because there's something wrong with the youth, their family, their community, their neighborhood. It's because of these larger systems of power and how they determine who has access to resources and safety and who doesn't. And so, just thinking about how we can support, like what your organization does, different communities without a deficit focus on like what's wrong, with those kids, those families. It's about these larger systems of power and disrupting those. And in terms of warning signs, we do on the PREVNet website have some lists that people can look for. I would say they're good to have, but they aren't predictive. They're not for sure going to be there or not. So things like becoming more withdrawn, not spending time with family or friends in the same way, seeming very agitated or anxious, spending all your time with your partner, those sorts of things, obviously, like bruising and other physical signs might be there, but it's often those sort of emotional or behavioral signs that people watch for. But I think for me, when I talk to youth, it's really about, how do you feel in your relationship? And so I think if for caring adults who know the youth that they work with or in their lives, if it seems like something's off, I would just encourage them to ask about relationships, not in a way like, is this happening or is that happening? But how do you feel when you're with them? Do you feel safe? Do you feel comfortable? Because dating violence relationships aren't all bad most of the time. And so youth might have a real mix of emotions and feelings. Sometimes they might feel good and sometimes not so much. And so it's really about having those conversations. And the first time you ask, they might not tell you. So keep asking and kind of learn from them what their experience is like. It's probably the best thing you can do.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because it can be, as you said, it can feel good, and there could be other times where it's just a whole different experience, right? Yeah. Coming to mind just as you're talking, and we're kind of morphing into different areas of conversation. Intergenerationally, then, do you find, although we're talking about youth, is there a pattern? Can there be a pattern intergenerationally? Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of risk factors, we know, and again, none of these are causal or determinative, and just because you've experienced one thing doesn't mean you'll experience the other, but we think a lot about cycles of violence. And so it's hard to pinpoint, where it starts, but youth who experience child maltreatment or other forms of neglect, or who witness domestic violence, are at higher risk for dating violence. Dating violence puts them at higher risk for themselves experiencing intimate partner violence in adulthood, which then puts their children at higher risk of experiencing maltreatment or witnessing, and kind of on and on. So it's definitely very cyclical. And so in terms of prevention, that means there's lots of points at which we can intervene, which is a good thing. I think one of the reasons I focus on dating violence is I think it's such an important point. Youth are transitioning. They're starting to define, who they are, their identity, what they want. That includes what they want in relationships. And so being able to prevent that violence before it starts and maybe becomes violence in adulthood is, I think, a really, not to say the others aren't important, but it's a really important prevention point. But yes, there are connections as well. And that's important when providers are working with youth, like to understand that context, because often youth have experienced and witnessed a lot, and really need to be approached in a compassionate and trauma-informed way, and thinking about kind of how, trauma works across generations, and incorporating that into the work that providers are doing, I think it's very critical.
Wow. No, thank you for that. That's awesome. Do you have a presentation? Would you like to?
Well, we've covered a lot of it, so I don't need to show. I had like basic facts and definitions, but we really covered a lot of it. So I don't know that it would add much, but
no, that's great. I'll just kind of go on here then. No, thank you so much. So then I'm just looking at violence. We talked about perpetrators, I guess, if you will. Is there a ratio? Is it imbalanced, or could you just speak more about that? Who would that be?
It's really complicated. So one, I'll just say we know less about perpetrators because a lot of this work is done in schools, and a lot of schools don't want to ask about perpetration. So we know more about victimization. I think the important thing to remember is that this violence and aggression it's happening in an interpersonal relationship. And so the ways that plays out often doesn't look as clean and as neat as maybe what we think, where there's like one victim, one perpetrator. It can become quite messy. And so in terms of prevalence of perpetration, it's lower than victimization, which is likely because people don't want to report as much. There might be, there's a lot more stigma about reporting. So, in Canada, about 10% of youth report perpetration, but again, it's tricky because it's harder to report for sure. One thing that we do see very consistently in dating violence is sort of aggression that some people call mutual. So both, again, it's not clean, like there's both partners are experiencing and using. Teasing that apart is really, really important. So sometimes that can happen because romantic relationships are new and youth are learning how to do them. And, some of that behavior can happen just because like you're figuring out how to be in this setting, and that's hard, and things get said or done that maybe are the result of just not yet having some of those conflict negotiation skills or things like that. But when it starts to involve like coercive control, so trying to control what you do, who you see, what you wear, that starts to look quite different. So there we might also see that both partners use violence, but one then is likely using it in self-defense. So again, it's really important to understand the context of the relationship. We do know in dating violence, both like all genders report victimization and perpetration. Again, it kind of depends on the type. So more severe sexual violence, stalking is disproportionately experienced by marginalized gender. So cisgender girls, non-binary, trans youth. Of all genders, trans youth are at the highest risk for victimization and perpetration, which is likely tied up in very complicated ways with experienced transphobia, experiences of violence themselves. So it's a very rambly answer only because
it's good.
For sure a lot of things, but I think the main things that providers or other folks, parents need to keep an eye out for is number one, boys can and are can be and are victims. And so
Yeah.
if a boy is talking to you about it, don't be immediately dismissive, learn more about the context. And that would go for youth of any gender. It can be mutual. That doesn't mean that someone's not a victim. It doesn't mean they don't need help. Again, like I'm saying, it could be because they're learning, all the way up to actually it's self-defense. And so really understanding what's happening in that relationship is really important.
Mhm.
And it's not unusual in dating violence. In fact, it's pretty unusual to see a relationship that's sort of perpetration only, where someone would only be perpetrating. That happens later in development. In
Uh-huh.
early to mid-adolescence, we see a lot more, like in the data that we looked at of those youth that experienced any dating violence, the vast majority, it was mutual. But again,
Wow.
that doesn't mean that they're both perpetrators. It just means there's something complicated
Yeah.
happening, and
Yeah.
we need to find out what that is for the individual relationship. But where things kind of change and where risk can really increase is if there's like that pattern of coercive control.
Oh.
So if it's not just about yelling at each other and pushing each other because you're mad and you're figuring out how to deal with that,
Mhm.
which we want to address, but
Yeah.
that's one type of violence versus the kind where one of the partners is really trying to control the other one in terms, again, of like who they see, what they wear, what they do. That's a situation where risk can really increase. And so understanding, again, those dynamics of the relationship is really important beyond
Mhm.
just, did you do this or did you do that?
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, you're fantastic in sharing your knowledge. I really appreciate
Yeah,
it. And I know our youth really appreciate it as well. Coming to mind as you're talking, could there be multiple situations where someone has multiple partners and then they're experiencing victimization?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, we think particularly about marginalized genders, cisgender girls, other diverse genders, and being in situations where, yeah, they're like multiply victimized across different partners, or in a situation where, yeah, there's just a lot of risk for victimization. We don't know from a research perspective very much about that at all, because it is likely more rare, but that doesn't mean it's not very important. Um, but yes, it can be, I think it can be very complicated, and even looking at what might seem simple, like it's still an interpersonal relationship, which has lots of different
Mhm.
pieces moving. So I think if this is happening, being really thoughtful and careful and trauma informed in terms of learning like what's happening in the relationship, what are the dynamics, in terms of figuring out kind of what are the types of support both youth need, whether they're using violence, experiencing it, or both using and experiencing it.
Mhm.
Um, it's really kind of like a one-off, like couple by couple
Mhm.
determination.
Yeah. And you had mentioned that PREVNet has evolved from anti-bullying education to this type of education as well. And it's wonderful actually that we're evolving in our society, that we're able to talk about these things more and more. But as you said, there's not always the research yet, or resources available, and it's evolving and growing as we go. And that's amazing actually, because if you even look at maybe your parents' generation, etc. How does that differ from previous generations to now, and how we're able to have that conversation? Was it more prevalent? Are there more things that are, making it happen today, I guess, if you will, as opposed to maybe 40 years ago or 50 years ago, for that matter?
Yeah, in terms of prevalence, the data we have, the oldest data we have is from the mid 90s. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but my thoughts would be, I mean, I guess it's likely quite similar. Certainly, yes, there have been, I mean, starting with awareness of domestic violence in the 60s, with movements around that, led by, in particular, Black and Hispanic women, and even recognizing that violence that happens in the context of interpersonal relationships is not okay.
Mhm.
That, just because you're in a relationship where sex happens doesn't mean you automatically give consent. All those things maybe we take a little bit for granted. Even not that long ago, were quite novel ideas. And so that, has definitely changed. I would hope that means just the idea that it's not okay to hit a partner when you're mad, particularly a male partner hitting a female partner, that there's definitely more awareness, the attitudes are different. I would hope that means there's less violence, but we don't necessarily have, for teens, we don't have that data. But because of that work to really build that awareness, and then started with adults and moving into youth, I think now at least youth can say this is happening and have someone hopefully believe them, although that is not something to take for granted. That does not always happen for sure. But it is at least a problem that people are hopefully aware of, that it does happen, that it's not okay. But that is all still very much, even 60 years on, a work in progress to continue to speak that that's not a way we want to be in our interpersonal relationships, that violence is not an effective way to solve conflict, that sexual violence is not okay, that we believe survivors, like all of those things are still very much work that needs to be done. And so I'm not sure if I answered your questions. In some ways it's better, because I think, at least people maybe know it's out there, but that in no way means we have solved it. And there's still a lot of work to do. There's still just so much victim blaming, and especially for cisgender girls and sexual violence, not being believed, being asked what they did, or what they wore. That all still happens all the time. And so there's still very much more work to do. But again, the youth are the ones that give me hope. They're so energized. They get this stuff. They get that it's not okay, in a way that even, I'm not that old, but even in my generation of the 90s, was that recognition wasn't there. I think about experiences of sexual harassment that I didn't have the words for. I didn't know what it was. And now talking to youth, they get it. They know what it is. And so there are changes, and they're positive. And I think listening to youth, they will continue to drive that, because they really, really get it in a way that adults don't so much.
I was just watching an interview with someone who was performing at a concert, and they had stopped the concert because they had witnessed the person in the audience being abused by their partner.
Wow.
And they had to have the security on it and such. But they were interviewed afterwards and just speaking about that we have to do better. Not as a society, right? We have to do better, and draw it in the sand. Basically, for what's
I'm
acceptable.
thinking about all the ways that violence are connected. So we focus on dating, and that's important, but youth see the ways, obviously, that violence is used in society to obtain certain outcomes. And when we think about prevention, we don't just, I think, again, people think about the physical violence, the sexual violence, but we think about violence on a continuum where it starts with that homophobic remark, that transphobic remark. Those are the kinds of things that allow use of violence to flourish and to become these other sorts of expressions, like physical and sexual violence. So when we think about prevention, it starts all the way back with those comments that demean women and other genders, that communicate that violence is acceptable or even desired.
It's interesting. I was working with a program a few years back, and the terminology had changed. Instead of victims of trauma, victims of torture, survivors of trauma. So survivors being the key word, and terminology is so important, and how we educate our youth, and they're teaching us.
I was gonna say, how they educate us.
Yes, exactly. Along the way, that empowerment of language use, and what to focus on, right? That's interesting. Yeah. No, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So you're watching and listening to Moksha Canada Foundation. We're doing Youth Connections Café, and we're talking about youth dating violence. And I'm just thrilled to speak with our guest, Dr. Deinera Exner-Cortens. And I'm learning and growing as we go, and I hope that you are too, and get an opportunity to educate yourself and seek out resources in your communities, and perhaps sharing knowledge and educating others along the way. So it's a great conversation. I wondered then perhaps if we can talk about, and again, this is pulling from your website, I guess consequences. What is that? Could you speak to that more?
Outcomes.
Outcomes. Yeah, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
for sure. So it's pretty well established. Again, none of this is causal or determinative. If you've experienced this, it does not mean this is going to happen. But on average, we know that youth that experience dating violence are more at risk for poor mental health. So things like anxiety, depressive symptoms, there's some evidence potentially around PTSD-like symptoms, which makes sense if you feel really scared and afraid in what is supposed to be a very intimate, supportive setting. It makes sense why that would have adverse effects on someone's mental health. There's some research connecting, obviously, injury is for physical and sexual violence is an outcome. Homicide, unfortunately, is an outcome, particularly in Canada, kind of that 20 to 25 range is at the highest risk for intimate partner homicide. But even youth kind of in the 18 to 20 range are also overrepresented. And so I don't say that flippantly or because it's not heavy, but I think people need to remember that this can really lead to the ultimate bad outcome. And it does happen in Canada every year. And so really thinking about this as a human rights issue is very, very important. And there's some work as well in like educational outcomes. Again, if you don't feel safe at school because you're perpetrators, they're like, how are you supposed to learn and grow if the school is not supporting you? So yeah, lots of potential negative outcomes related to dating violence. And so one of the things that we hope for health providers is, if youth are experiencing some of these things, talking to them about their relationships, kind of seeing what's going on is really, really important because it might be tied back to what's happening with a dating or sexual partner. And so just considering that when youth maybe are coming in with like new onset of anxiety symptoms or depressive symptoms, if they have injuries, if they're experiencing a traumatic, like a concussion or something like that. We're just working on some research that's not out yet, but showing some of those links. And so just, when youth are reporting injury or other symptoms, like thinking about dating relationships as a context to ask about and kind of learn about what might be happening in that area as well.
During COVID, was that a conversation with your colleagues with this topic matter? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and we don't have, so soon we'll have some post-COVID data to kind of look at maybe what happened. Certainly for adults, we know that domestic violence rates went up during the pandemic. For youth, we're not as sure because a lot of youth don't live with their partner. So in that way, that may have been protective. However, if a lot of the violence they're experiencing happened via online methods, they're online more, that might mean they're facing more violence. And then if they're not going to school where potentially there's some resources or prevention, that might also put them at risk and just in terms of keeping them more isolated. So it's all sort of hypothetical. We don't have data on it yet. But yeah, definitely around isolation, that's a concern for sure. But yeah, unlike adults, we don't have sort of data on what happened during the pandemic, but that will be something to continue to learn about, I think.
I look forward to learning more about that myself as well. Then in terms of legislation, could you speak to that to our audience who may want to learn more about how do you legislate change?
Yeah. So be quick because we don't really have any. So it's quick.
Like that.
Yeah.
Somewhat.
So in some provinces, so there's nothing in any education act across Canada specific to dating violence. A number of them do talk about bullying, and so it's possible that depending on how it's worded, that might be used for dating violence advocacy, but none of them explicitly state it. It's not in any family or domestic violence acts generally. Again, if you live with your partner or you have a child in common, you might be eligible, but it's really not clear. And so all of that is not ideal, because when it's not named specifically, when it's not clear that youth are eligible for different remedies under domestic violence acts, be that orders of protection, shelter space, then that just becomes another fight for youth. It's also terribly confusing. I get questions from service providers a lot about, well, is it this kind of issue? Can this sort of remedy be applied? And nobody, like, it's very confusing. And so one of our projects at PREVNet is to really offer our services to status of women offices, education ministries, around providing information and encouraging them to think about this in their acts. Canada is in the process of negotiating bilateral agreements with every province and territory for the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. And so we've contacted every status of women minister across the country. Youth are not mentioned in that plan. And that's a huge miss, both because youth deserve to be part of it, and also because it's such a critical time if you're going to prevent gender-based violence to start with youth. And so we've contacted every status of women minister and let them know we'd be very happy to talk about what kind of things they might put in that for youth, because that's a huge amount of money that's going to flow into gender-based violence prevention, and youth really need to be engaged and a part of that. So I mean, in an ideal world, I'd like to see it named in education acts, much like bullying, because I think, again, if it's not named specifically, then you're leaving it up to individuals, schools, division to like learn about it and decide if it falls under kind of what their jurisdiction is in terms of safe and welcoming schools.
That's a good point.
To see youth specifically named in domestic violence acts in terms of what they're eligible for, so that judges know, and family court knows. So that would be really important. Those are some key. And then obviously, like at individual school division levels, they can definitely do a lot in terms of having specific policy that names dating violence, that spells out what it is, what are the options to students if it happens. So very similar to the work a lot of school divisions did around bullying about a decade ago. Trying to do that around dating violence, so that it's really clear to youth and caregivers, what it is and what their options are if it happens.
You mentioned speaking to different ministers. We've just had a cabinet shuffle.
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to go to speak at Parliament at all about this subject?
No, but if you know anyone, let me know. We've been, we do try to connect with both the Public Health Agency of Canada. They're a major funder, and work with them to support the work they're doing on teen dating violence. And also, Status of Women is doing more of the kind of intervention work. So yes, we're very happy to chat with anyone who would like information. I do feel like at this point, a lot of the work we're doing is awareness. And so that's, like, we're so grateful for opportunities like this, because people don't necessarily know that this is an issue, that it is something that a lot of youth experience. It is connected to really not great outcomes, and that it is something we can prevent. And so I think just opportunities like this to talk about it and get the word out is what we're really focused on right now.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We have a little bit more time together, and I wondered if you wanted to branch out into any other parts of conversation and highlight things that we may not know about, and you could shine light on us for.
I don't think so. I mean, I think your questions were all really excellent. I'm just looking at what I had kind of wanted to chat about, and we've basically hit all of it. I think our website, which hopefully you can put up, youthdatingviolence.prevnet.ca, we've got a ton of information on there. We're currently reorganizing it due to the large amount of information, but there's information for youth. Our National Youth Advisory is awesome and has created a bunch of resources designed by youth for youth around a lot of these topics. And so you can check that out. We have a ton of stuff for educators. So we have a number of and are continuing to develop educator trainings. So what should you do as an educator? What can you do? We know, educators have a million things on their plate and trying not to add to that, but how might this work with kind of the day-to-day things you do already? We've got information for parents and caregivers, as well as service providers. So I think there's a lot of information out there, and just hopefully letting folks know where to find it is really important for youth. If this is something you're experiencing nationally, Kids Help Phone is the best place to call overall. There may be other numbers that better serve different communities, but we don't have like a national youth dating violence helpline. And so
Not yet.
Not yet.
And
Yes.
hopefully not.
On
Hopefully
my
never
list
need
of
it.
things.
Yeah,
Yes.
on your
Yes.
list of wish list.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one in the States, but we don't yet have one. So yeah, it can be really, I think I would just say, if you're experiencing dating violence, you're not alone. If you're feeling unsafe, that's not how relationships are supposed to feel. And so hopefully the resources we have, you can read about different kinds of violence, what a healthy relationship is, and really define that for yourself. And right now, a lot of the resources that are available aren't youth friendly. And so, yeah, I guess
that's good. Well,
yeah, it's unfortunate, but push, I think
push.
try
Yeah.
to find,
Yeah.
those resources. If you're, friends, we know youth are most likely to disclose to a friend. And so if you're a friend, you can go and read up on what you can do as a friend, because there are definitely things you can do, and providing that support, that validation, that championing can be really important, because so many of the resources aren't youth friendly. Your friend probably is going to need a lot of emotional support, and you can help to provide that in a way that's, safe for you. And so it's not just a problem of victims and perpetrators. Like, we know, friends can play a huge role in helping. And so even if it's not something that's happening to you, which is great, you can still read up on it to make sure you know what to say or do if a friend does experience it.
So for anybody listening and tuning in, you mentioned Kids Help Phone. And so if they were to call that number, they would be able to have a conversation, not necessarily divulging who they are, but be able to link into conversation and perhaps resources that would be available to you. Yeah.
So you can call, you can chat anonymously, and hopefully they can provide some resources. Again, it's tricky, like in a lot of communities, there might be like a women's resource center or violence against women organization. They may do youth dating violence stuff, even if their name doesn't suggest it. So if you're, a caregiver or a friend, you can always call for someone and ask, like, without disclosing anything, if they do that kind of work. So right now it still means a little bit of ingenuity sometimes, but to find like the right door, which is not ideal at all, and is something we really want to work towards. But there are a lot of folks across the country who really want to help with this. And so, I think I wish I had a number or a place like just go here, and obviously for rural youth, that becomes even more challenging. And so, but if on our website, we've tried to compile like more than just Kids Help Phone, but like lots of different resources that folks might reach out to.
Wow. And then as far as professionally, what drew you into this field? You're very passionate about youth, but how did you, navigate your way and realize that this is something you really wanted to research and do?
Yeah, so I started my work in adult domestic violence and sexual violence. And I think when I was doing my master's training, really recognizing for myself, even the first time, that like this is something that happens to youth, and violence is never okay, and it's a rights violation. But just the idea, I guess, that in a first dating relationship, you're experiencing this and you have no other idea, like that it's not okay, or that there's other options. Like, you can imagine if it's your first relationship and this is what happens. I mean, how do you know if that's right or wrong? And there's so many mixed messages out there about what relationships should be or shouldn't be. So yeah, I think just combining my interest and passion in supporting youth, and then wanting them not to have these experiences, because they're really awful, and we can do things to prevent them, and we should. So
thank you.
that's how I kind of came to it. So.
Amazing. It's always good to hear if someone wanted to get into the field themselves,
Totally. And we need people. We need
it.
smart youth to become the future leaders in this area. So yeah.
And our audience is definitely listening and watching
Yes.
for sure. So, and words of wisdom, you've given that throughout the program, but in particular, words of wisdom for professionals, but also for our youth before we sign off.
Yeah. I would say if you work with youth, learn about this issue. You don't have to become an expert. You may have lots of other things on your plate. You might be a soccer coach or a teacher or a healthcare provider, but learn about it so that you know what you could do, that it does even happen, and try to do some of that groundwork about who in your community you can refer to. Because I think if you do work with a youth who is experiencing this, being able to give them that warm handoff to an organization is actually going to be helpful is super, super important. Because if you just give them a random organization or one that maybe isn't so used to this and it's a bad experience, like that might be enough. The youth might say, fair enough, like this is helpful. So I think if you can do some of that work ahead of time and have that resource ready, that would be really important. And just believe youth when they tell you these things. This youth don't just disclose this randomly. It's not something they make up. If they're telling you this, it's really, really important to listen, to believe them, to ask about their experience, and then to find that warm handoff to someone who does specialize in this, who can help them work through that experience.
Well, I love the way you said warm handoff. It's beautiful, actually. It really is. I think we should get T-shirts, the warm handoff.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think sometimes when this, one of the things more in adult domestic violence, but like folks are afraid to talk about this because it's like opening Pandora's box and like, what do I do? What do I do? And I guess one of the messages for most adults who work with youth is like, your job is to listen, to validate, to support the youth, and then to get them to the right next door. So it's not about you coming in and like fixing the whole thing. Like there are folks across the country who work in this area who, like we've talked about, it's very complex. There's a lot of dynamics. We want to get them to the right people.
Yeah.
And so that's really your job. And so I think just hopefully keeping that in mind might make it a little less overwhelming for people to talk to youth about this. So.
Awesome. Thank you. And words of wisdom for our youth before we sign off.
Oh, well, other than you're great, keep doing what you're doing. Adults don't listen to you, and they should. And just keep the passion and momentum, because you are changing the way that adults understand these issues, and soon you'll be the adults and can make those changes. But just keep doing the work. And like I say, most youth, even in Canada, 2/3 of youth won't experience this, but you might be the friend of someone who does. And so learning what you can do as a friend, very similar to adults in terms of listening, supporting, and then helping to find that next door that's going to be the type of person that can help your friend, is something really important that you can do.
And I love how you said you're great, because it's a validation if I see you and I hear you. Very, very important for our youth of today. That's amazing. I just feel really empowered with the knowledge that you've shared. And I hope that our youth has felt that as well too, by listening and tuning in. And we'll reach out to the resources that you had mentioned, but also to underscore the work that you do for the research that you do and you and your colleagues. And then if you just wanted to do a shout out for PREVNet one more time.
Yeah, so PREVNet has a lot of resources. You can access our website at youthdatingviolence.prevnet.ca. We're also on Instagram and Twitter for as long as it exists. So find us in many places. Our Instagram is really focused on youth, so check us out there. And yeah, we hope that the resources we have are helpful to people as they learn about this issue.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We have been listening and speaking with Dr. Deinera Exner-Cortens, and I'm just so honored to have had the time with you at Youth Connections Café. My name is Lynne McIntee. I've been your humble host for today. Please reach out to us on social media. We are about connecting, creating new programming, and inspiring the youth of today. Give us an idea and follow us on social media. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.